Imagine waking up one morning and hearing that strange gas bubbles had started erupting from the Arctic Ocean. At first, it sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but this isn't fiction, it's methane, and it's coming out fast. Scientists had warned about this for years, what they called the methane feedback loop, but now it's no longer a warning, it's happening. And if it keeps going, it could spiral so far out of control that it ends life on Earth as we know it. It all starts with rising global temperatures. Over the past few decades, the Arctic has been warming about 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And hidden underneath the frozen ground and seabeds of the Arctic, what's called permafrost, are enormous reserves of methane gas. We're talking about billions of tons of it. Methane is way more powerful than carbon dioxide when it comes to trapping heat in the atmosphere, over 80 times more powerful in the short term. As the permafrost melts, methane that's been locked away for tens of thousands of years begins to escape. The more methane is released, the more it heats the planet. And the more the planet heats up, the more permafrost melts. That's the feedback loop. It feeds itself. There's no off switch, it just builds and builds. At first, the release might go unnoticed, just small plumes bubbling up from remote parts of Siberia and the Arctic Sea, but satellites would start to detect rising concentrations of methane in the atmosphere. Climate models would begin to shift from bad to catastrophic. Within just a few short years, global temperatures would jump by several degrees. Oceans would heat up faster than expected. Weather would start acting strange. Entire seasons would shift. Some parts of the world would go straight from winter to summer, skipping spring entirely. Crops would fail. Forests would dry out and catch fire. But this is only the beginning. The terrifying part is that once this chain reaction truly begins, it's impossible to stop. Even if every country on Earth stopped burning fossil fuels overnight, the feedback loop wouldn't care. It would keep going on its own. The planet would be heating itself, powered by methane escaping from deep beneath the Earth, like the planet was opening old wounds we thought were long buried. And the more that escapes, the faster things unravel. The polar regions, once frozen for millions of years, would begin releasing methane at a scale never seen before in human history. Giant craters would appear where the ground collapsed after the methane exploded out of the permafrost. People living in the far north might see pillars of fire shooting out of the earth or ocean like the planet itself was venting. This would be the turning point. Not a storm or a war, not even a virus. Just invisible gas rising into the sky, quiet, slow, and absolutely deadly. And by the time the world fully realizes what's happening, it might already be too late to stop what comes next. By the time the methane feedback loop really takes off, the climate would start changing faster than people or governments could react. Within just a few short years, temperatures would rise so quickly that entire ecosystems would begin to crash. The oceans would absorb a lot of that heat at first, but even they have a breaking point. Sea surface temperatures would climb high enough to wipe out coral reefs, disrupt fish migration, and kill off major food sources for millions of people. Coastal cities would be the first to feel the pressure. With polar ice melting at a breakneck pace, sea levels would rise faster than any predictions. Low-lying areas like Miami, New Orleans, and large parts of California's coast could be underwater within a couple decades, maybe even sooner. Salt water would start seeping into farmland, wiping out crops and contaminating drinking water. But the scariest part wouldn't be just the rising seas or the heat. It would be the massive, unstoppable weather shifts. Entire storm systems would become larger, stronger, and more unpredictable. Hurricanes in the Pacific would slam into cities that had never seen storms like that before. Inland heat waves would grow so intense that parts of places like Phoenix or Las Vegas could see outdoor conditions so hot they'd be deadly in minutes. It wouldn't be just uncomfortable, it would be unlivable. Regions that once had mild climates like Oregon or Washington would begin facing long droughts and raging wildfires year after year. California could turn into a dry wasteland, its reservoirs empty, its farmland scorched. Massive blackouts would sweep across states as the power grid struggled under the pressure of record-breaking temperatures and failing infrastructure. Fires would break out so fast and burn so hot that entire neighborhoods might be gone in hours. Across the Great Plains and into the Midwest, the situation would only get worse. With unpredictable rainfall and extreme temperature shifts, the farming heartland of America would fail. Crops like corn and wheat wouldn't be able to grow in the new conditions. Livestock would die from heat stress or disease. Grocery store shelves would empty faster than they could be restocked. Meanwhile, people would try to move away from the worst hit areas, creating waves of climate refugees within the same country. But where would they go? The north. Even places like Canada and Alaska would be dealing with their own fires, floods, and food shortages. The pressure on governments would be overwhelming. There would be no time to build new cities or plan for millions of people to relocate. The changes would be happening too fast, and still the methane would keep rising, feeding the heat, pushing the planet closer to a point where the climate itself becomes completely unstable, beyond anything we've ever known. As the methane buildup in the atmosphere keeps growing, the world's temperature would rise beyond the threshold of what most life can survive. It wouldn't just be a few places suffering, it would be nearly everywhere. Areas close to the equator would turn into literal death zones. In countries across Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, the heat index would reach levels that the human body simply cannot handle. In some regions, just stepping outside without protection could mean heat stroke within minutes. In cities that once felt safe, the heat would get worse each summer. Major urban centers like Los Angeles, Tokyo, and Paris could face temperatures over 130 degrees Fahrenheit during prolonged heat waves. Asphalt would melt, buildings would trap heat, and nighttime wouldn't bring relief. In fact, in some places, the nights could be even more dangerous than the days. Without cooling, people would begin dying in their homes simply because the air never cooled down. At the same time, the Arctic would be completely transformed. The permafrost, frozen ground that's been locked in place for thousands of years, would thaw completely. With every inch of that frozen ground that melts, more methane and carbon dioxide would be released. Old viruses and bacteria trapped for tens of thousands of years might also escape, adding another layer of danger. This wouldn't be science fiction, it would be a real biological threat. In Antarctica, the massive ice shelves would break off and crash into the ocean. That alone would cause sea levels to rise even faster. Coastal cities around the world would go from flooded to permanently submerged. New York City's streets would vanish underwater. San Francisco's bay would stretch far inland. Entire island nations would disappear beneath the waves. The scale of change would be impossible to keep up with. Global wind and rain patterns would stop behaving like they used to. Monsoon seasons would shift or vanish altogether. Rivers like the Mississippi and the Amazon could dry up in places or flood unpredictably in others. Dust storms the size of small countries would sweep across once fertile land, stripping away the last layers of topsoil. Even forests like the Amazon would start to collapse, first from drought, then from fire, and eventually from becoming carbon emitters instead of carbon sinks. This rapid environmental breakdown would leave almost no safe place on Earth. By this point, food systems would be gone. The ocean's fish populations would collapse due to rising temperatures and acidification. Drinking water would be scarce in every region. People who survived the heat would be left with nothing to eat or drink. And yet, the worst part is that no one would be able to stop it anymore. The methane feedback loop would be fully self-sustaining. Every new release of gas would trap more heat, which would then melt more permafrost, release more gas, and so on. It would be a runaway chain reaction, one that doesn't slow down, doesn't pause, and doesn't reverse. There would be no pause button. No part of the world would be untouched. At this stage of the methane feedback disaster, survival would be nearly impossible. With each passing week, the world would grow hotter, drier, and more unstable. Regions that once had stable weather patterns would now be facing extremes on every front. Unending droughts, storms the size of entire countries, and wildfires that move too fast to outrun. The skies would look different too. Smoke from continent-wide fires would darken the atmosphere, blocking sunlight in some areas and turning day into a dim red glow. In others, the sun would beat down through a thin layer of greenhouse gases, making it feel like the entire sky was pressing down. Breathing the air would be dangerous almost everywhere, with oxygen levels dropping and toxic gases filling the air. By this point, all governments would have collapsed. There would be no systems left to manage anything. No power grids, no hospitals, no emergency services. Satellites might still orbit the Earth for a while, silently capturing images of a dying planet. But communication between surviving groups would mostly be gone. Every region would be on its own, and even then the chances of survival would be slim. The oceans, now overheated and acidic, would emit more methane from clathraides buried under the seabed. These frozen gas pockets had been stable for thousands of years, but the rising temperature of the water would shatter that stability. As the clathraides broke apart, massive methane eruptions would bubble to the surface, adding even more gas into the air and making the heat even worse. Even in the best possible shelters, life would be incredibly difficult. Underground bunkers or remote research stations, like those in Antarctica, might buy a little more time, but eventually the same patterns would reach them. Supply chains would have been gone for months. Plants wouldn't grow, animals would be long extinct, water sources would be too contaminated or too evaporated to be of use. In the end, isolation would only delay the inevitable. The final stage of the methane feedback loop wouldn't be marked by one big event. There would be no loud explosion or dramatic finish. It would be a slow, unstoppable unraveling of every system that once supported life. Humanity would fade, not all at once, but city by city, shelter by shelter, until there was no one left to witness what Earth had become. In a few centuries, the planet might cool again. The methane might eventually break down. Nature, in some new form, could reclaim what remains. But humanity would be gone. The cities, the satellites, the history, we would become another chapter in Earth's long timeline, buried under layers of heat, fire, and silence. This is the terrifying power of a runaway methane feedback loop, a slow, invisible tipping point that could erase everything without a single weapon or explosion. Just heat, just gas, just time,